He thought his wife had lost everything. Then a luxury empire opened its doors to the woman he underestimated. Seraphina Vale sent the photograph at 12:38 in the morning. No text. No explanation. Just an image, a luxury hotel room. White silk shirt draped over a chair, 2 wine glasses on the nightstand, and in the mirror above the dresser, the unmistakable reflection of Seraphina's new husband fastening his watch. Julian Moreau. Still dressed, already leaving. They had been married for less than 5 hours. When Seraphina called, Marcella answered on the second ring calm, almost bored, and told her sister everything. Not because she felt guilty, because she wanted Seraphina to know exactly who had won. The affair had been running for nearly 4 years. If you've ever trusted someone completely and discovered that trust was a door they walked through to take everything from you, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel, hit like, and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that hotel room and the woman who was just getting started. The bridal suite at the Alderton was everything Julian had promised. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, fresh orchids on every surface, a bottle of champagne untouched, slowly losing its chill and its silver bucket. Seraphina Vale had looked at that room 3 hours earlier and thought she was finally standing at the beginning of something real. Now she sat on the edge of the bed, still in her wedding dress, her phone face down on the pillow beside her, and she stared at the wall like she was waiting for it to tell her something useful. The dress was ivory silk, custom. It had taken 6 fittings. She was 29 years old, the only surviving legitimate daughter of the Vale family, and she had just found out her marriage was a transaction she hadn't known she was part of. She didn't cry right away. That detail would matter later. She just sat there very still, in that expensive room, with the harbor lights glittering outside like nothing in the world had changed, and she breathed. In, out, in, out. Julian's tablet was on the desk where he'd left it when he got the call, some business emergency. He'd said, kissing her cheek, "Be right back, don't wait up," and she'd watched him leave without really looking at him. That was the version of the night she'd been living, until Marcella sent the photograph. The tablet wasn't locked. She didn't plan to look at it. She moved toward the desk because the champagne was nearby, and she thought maybe she needed a drink. And then her eyes landed on the screen, and the screen showed a name she recognized, not Julian's name, not a client's name, not a business contact's name. Her name, Seraphina Vale, in a subject line, in a message thread she had never seen. She sat down at the desk. She opened the thread. She read it all. It took her 47 minutes. She wasn't a slow reader. She read fast. Actually, she'd been the kind of child who finished books on the same day she started them, who read the last page first just to know where she was headed. That habit had driven her mother half crazy. "Sarah, you'll ruin the ending for yourself." But Seraphina had always believed it was better to know where you were going than to be surprised by something you could have seen coming. She had not seen this coming. The messages between Julian and Gideon Rusk, his business partner, a man she'd sat dinner 12 separate times, laid out everything plainly, not in coded language, not in hints, in direct, practical, almost boring terms. The Vale name carried weight in 3 distinct financial sectors. Seraphina's signature on certain documents would allow restructuring of loans that Julian's own credit history could not support. Her family's legacies in Boston's old commercial real estate market was, as Gideon put it in one message, the key that opens the lock the bank put on us 2 years ago. Julian's response, marrying a Vale solves problems, being with you doesn't. Gideon had been asking about Marcella, whether she was still an option. Julian had explained, with the patience of a man explaining something to someone slow, that Marcella was useful in private, but that Seraphina was the one whose name appeared on the legal documents. Seraphina was the named beneficiary. Seraphina sat on 2 charitable boards that opened doors to the kind of people Julian needed to impress. Seraphina's face at his side changed the way rooms responded to him. There were also financial records, documents bearing her signature that she had never signed. Not forged exactly, more like borrowed. Variations on her actual signature, close enough to pass an initial review, on authorizations for transfers and guarantees she had never agreed to. She recognized her own name at the bottom of 3 separate letters of financial guarantee. She did not recognize having written any of them. She didn't call anyone that night. Not Mara. Not the attorney she'd met once at a cocktail party, who'd handed her a card and said, "If you ever need someone who plays hardball, I'm your woman." Not her cousin in London, who would have answered at any hour. Not the front desk to demand an explanation from her husband's absence. She did one thing. She picked up Julian's tablet and she photographed every document on it, every message, every file she could access. She worked methodically, the way she'd learned to work when her father died. And she'd had to go through his office alone because her mother was too raw to enter the room file by file, folder by folder, no skipping, no assuming anything was irrelevant. When she was done, she set the tablet back exactly where it had been. Same angle, same screen dim, same small scratch on the leather case facing right. Then she took off her wedding shoes, sat back down on the edge of the bed, and let herself think. She was good at thinking when other people would have been falling apart. She'd been told this was a cold quality. Her mother had said it differently, Seraphina. You feel things sideways, not straight on, and she'd never been sure if it was a compliment or a concern. Right now, feeling things sideways was the only thing keeping her from doing something she couldn't take back. Julian would return. She needed to know what he expected to find when he did. A devastated bride was the predictable outcome. Tears, accusations, demands. That was the shape of a confrontation he could prepare for, could manage, could control, could redirect with the right combination of apology and affection and financial reassurance. A quiet wife, reading in bed, who said nothing about the photograph that was a different problem. She decided to be the second kind. He came back at 2:11 a.m. She heard his keycard in the door. She had the bedside lamp on, low. She'd changed out of the wedding dress, folded it with more care than she felt, and pulled on a robe. She was sitting up in bed with a magazine she wasn't reading when he came in. He looked at his jacket was over one arm. He smelled like hotel air and faintly unmistakably a perfume she recognized. Marcella wore it, had worn it for years. Seraphina had always liked it. Hey, she said. He crossed to the bed, sat on the edge, looked at her with the expression she'd spent 2 years reading as sincerity, and now understood was just a face he made when he needed something from her. I'm sorry about tonight. The Rusk situation, it's complicated. I didn't want to bring business into... It's fine, she said. You're back. He looked at her for a moment too long, like he was checking for something. Then he relaxed, and she watched the relaxation move through him, shoulders dropping, jaw loosening, and she understood that he'd been braced for a fight and was relieved not to find one. You okay? He asked. Tired, she said. It was a long day. He kissed her forehead. She did not flinch. Get some sleep, he said. We can do breakfast tomorrow. We've got time. She smiled at him. He went to the bathroom. She put the magazine down, turned off the lamp, lay back in the dark, and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow, she decided, was the beginning of something, just not the something he was expecting. Her full name was Seraphina Vale, and the Vale name had come attached to enough history to fill a book she'd never wanted to read. Her grandfather had built the original Vale commercial properties in Boston's financial district in the early 70s. Her father had grown the portfolio quietly and competently for 3 decades, keeping a low profile by choice, trusting in the kind of wealth that doesn't need to announce itself. Her mother, Constance, had managed the family's philanthropic arm with the same precision she applied to everything organized, purposeful, exactly as visible as she chose to be. Seraphina had grown up with the weight of that name sitting on her shoulders like something she was expected to carry without complaining. She'd never been reckless with it, never traded on it carelessly, never let anyone use her as a door to something she hadn't agreed to walk through herself, or so she'd believed. The week after the wedding, while Julian went about his life with the confidence of a man who has achieved exactly what he planned, Seraphina made 3 phone calls. The first was to Mara Bellamy. Mara was 34'5'2" in heels and had worked as a paralegal for 9 years before deciding she was smarter than most of the lawyers she worked for and going independent as a legal research consultant. She and Seraphina had been friends since college, the kind of friends who didn't talk every day, but who could call at midnight and say, I need you to not ask questions yet, and know they'd get a yes. Seraphina called her on a Tuesday morning from a cafe, 2 blocks from the hotel, speaking quietly over an oat milk coffee she didn't want. Need to find someone, she said. An attorney. Not the family kind. Not someone who knew my father. Someone aggressive. Mara didn't miss a beat. What kind of aggressive? Corporate. Property law, document fraud. Someone who looks at the word no and treats it like an interesting challenge. There was a pause. Is this about Julian? Yes. Another pause. Shorter this time. Okay, give me 24 hours. The second call was to Seraphina's bank, the personal account she'd maintained separately from the joint account. Julian had proposed during their engagement. She'd agreed to the joint account. She'd never closed the personal one. Julian had never asked about it, which she now understood was because he hadn't thought it mattered. He was wrong about a lot of things regarding her. The third call was harder. She dialed her sister's number, and it rang 4 times and went to voicemail, and Seraphina stood on the sidewalk outside the cafe and watched a delivery truck navigate around a double-parked cab and thought about all the years she'd been Marcella's older sister looking out for her, covering for her, making excuses for her to their mother. And then she thought about Julian's face when he came back to the hotel room and looked at her to see if she was broken yet. She didn't leave a voicemail. She just ended the call. She went back to the hotel and she was a good wife for another 6 days. Vivian Cross was 41 years old and had a reputation in Boston's legal community as someone who won by being 2 moves ahead and smiling the whole time. Mara set up the meeting at a small office above a financial consulting firm in the Back Bay. Nothing visible from the street, which Vivian had apparently chosen deliberately. She met Seraphina with a handshake that was firm to the point of statement and said, "Your friend says you need someone who doesn't back down." "That's accurate," Seraphina said. "Tell me everything." She told her everything. Vivian listened without writing anything down, which Seraphina initially found unnerving, and then realized was intentional. No notes meant no discoverable record until they decided there should be one. When Seraphina finished, Vivian leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for about 4 seconds. "The forged signatures," she said finally. "They're not exactly forged," Seraphina said. "They're close. Close enough to challenge. Close enough to void the guarantees with the right argument." Vivian tapped the edge of her desk with one finger. "Here's what I want to know. What do you actually want out of this?" Seraphina thought about it. "My name," she said. "I want my name back. I want every document that has my name on it in connection with his businesses either nullified or corrected. I want any financial guarantee, any authorization, any proxy, anything that ties me to his empire severed completely. I'm not interested in his money. I don't want alimony. I just want out, and I want it done in a way that doesn't leave anything behind that he can use later." Vivian looked at her for a long moment. "That's a different kind of case than most people bring me. I know, most people want blood." "I want clean," Seraphina said. "Blood is messy and it takes too long." Vivian almost smiled. "All right," she said. "Then let's talk about how we do this quietly." The 7 days that followed were the strangest of Seraphina's life, and she had lived through her father's sudden death at 56 and a year of her mother's grief afterward, so she had some basis for comparison. She was in 2 places at once. The surface Seraphina moved through the days of early marriage. With appropriate warmth she had dinner with Julian, asked questions about his work that sounded like interest and were actually intelligence gathering, went to a charity event on his arm and smiled at Gideon Rusk's wife without letting her hands tighten. She was present. She was performing a woman she no longer was. Beneath that, the other Seraphina was working. Vivian filed the first round of resignation documents on day 2. Seraphina's removal from 3 corporate boards she'd been listed on without her knowledge. Vivian's argument was that the original authorizations were procedurally deficient, technically true, given that Seraphina had never formally consented in writing, and Julian had apparently assumed a verbal agreement was sufficient. It was not sufficient. On day 3, Mara found evidence that Seraphina's name had been used in a letter of reference to a private banking institution. The letter implied Seraphina had personally vetted Julian's financial history. She had never written any such letter. On day 4, everything accelerated. Julian came home from a meeting, and he was different, not angry, not accusatory, just watchful in a way he hadn't been before. He stood in the kitchen while she made tea she didn't want, and he asked about her week with the careful specificity of someone who has received partial information and is trying to complete the picture without revealing that he's looking. She told him about a lunch with Mara. She did not mention Vivian. He nodded and looked at her for 3 beats, too many before going to change. That night Mara texted her. Someone accessed the resignation filings. Not us. Looked it up. Access was logged from a Boston-registered device at 11:47 p.m. "You have someone watching you." Seraphina sat in the bathroom with the door locked and read the message twice, and then set her phone face down on the marble counter and looked at herself in the mirror. She'd given herself 7 days. She now had 3 left, and someone, Julian or Gideon or whoever they'd paid to monitor his legal exposure, knew something was moving. The plan changed. She didn't panic. This was the thing about Seraphina that Julian had read as passivity, and that was actually its opposite. She could change direction without losing her footing. She'd learned it from her father, who used to say that the only difference between a good decision and a bad one is whether you made it with your head or your fear. She made it with her head. She called Vivian from a payphone, an actual payphone, in the lobby of a Marriott 3 blocks from the Alderton, and told her to file everything they had immediately, not to wait for day 7. How complete are we? Vivian asked. Enough, Seraphina said. We get the rest after, all right. I'll move tonight. She called Mara next. I need the second exit. Mara had prepared a second exit 3 days earlier, because Seraphina had asked her to, and because Mara understood that plans are only as good as their backups. There was an apartment in Cambridge belonging to a friend of Mara's, who was in Portugal for 6 weeks. There was a car Mara had rented under her own name. There were copies of every document Seraphina needed: passport, financial records, the evidence from Julian's tablet in a sealed envelope, waiting at Mara's office. When Mara said, "Tomorrow morning," Seraphina said, "before he's up, okay?" She went back to the hotel. She slept, or something close enough to it. In the morning, she dressed quietly and left Julian's jacket hanging on its hook and the champagne still in its silver bucket, brown and flat now after almost 2 weeks. She left a card on his pillow, a small cream card, the kind you'd put with flowers, and on it wrote seven words in her own handwriting. I know. Good luck. And then her name, Seraphina. She left the wedding ring beside it. She walked out with one bag. He found it at noon. She knew because Mara's phone showed 3 calls from Julian's number starting at 12:04. Mara let them go to voicemail. The first message was controlled. The second was less controlled. The third he didn't finish, just ended the call abruptly. She was already in the car by then. Seraphina sat in the passenger seat while Mara drove and watched Boston Center move past the windows, the street she'd grown up in, the neighborhood she'd navigated her whole life, and she didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel relief exactly. She felt something that didn't have a clean name, like a door closing behind you in a room where the air had slowly been getting worse and worse, and you only realize how bad it was once you're in the hallway. You okay? Mara said. Ask me in a week. Mara nodded and didn't push it. Seraphina turned back to the window. She had her name. She had her evidence. She had severed as many of the legal ties as Vivian could cut in 4 days of fast work. The rest would follow through formal proceedings that Julian's attorneys would have to respond to, and the responses would be revealing in their own right. She had one more thing. 11 days after leaving Boston, alone in a pharmacy in a town she'd never been to before, she would learn she was carrying Julian Moreau's child. But that was not yet. Right now, she was just a woman in a car, watching her city recede through the glass. She pressed her fingers flat against the window for a moment, then let her hand fall to her lap. In a city they were already leaving behind, Julian Moreau stood in a bridal suite that smelled like old flowers and read 7 words on a cream card and understood, for the first time, that the woman he'd chosen, because her name opened doors, had just closed one in his face. He'd never seen it coming. She had. Part 2. The apartment in Cambridge smelled like someone else's life. Wool blankets folded on the couch. A French press on the counter with someone else's coffee still in the bottom. A row of paperback novels in a language Seraphina didn't read, spines cracked from actual use, the kind of books that had been lived in rather than displayed. Mara's friend had good taste, and no idea a stranger was sleeping in her space, and Seraphina moved through the rooms carefully, like a guest who understood she had not been invited. She didn't unpack the first night. She sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed, with her bag still zipped, and she thought about the cream card she'd left on Julian's pillow, and wondered which version of him had read it, the controlled one, who would immediately call his attorneys, or the one who got rattled when something didn't go the way he'd planned it. She didn't wonder long. She knew which one. He would be controlled for approximately 45 minutes, and then he'd get on the phone with Gideon, and Gideon would be the one who got rattled, and that rattling would get directed back at Julian as something resembling blame. And Julian would take that in and compact it down into something harder and colder and begin making calls. She was ready for the calls. What she wasn't ready for was how quiet the apartment was at 3 in the morning, how still Cambridge was compared to the harbor view at the Alderton, how completely alone she was, in a way that had nothing to do with the number of people she could reach on the phone. She put her palm flat on the empty half of the bed. Then she got up and went to make tea. Vivian filed the remaining documentation on a Thursday morning. Seraphina sat in a chair in Vivian's office and watched her sign the last set of motions, with the brisk efficiency of someone who signs things all day and finds the act itself unremarkable. The stack was not small. 2 weeks of compressed legal work that would normally take 2 months, forced into a short window by circumstance, and Vivian's apparent refusal to acknowledge the concept of limited office hours. He's going to respond, Vivian said, not looking up from the final page. I know. His attorney is Marcus Webb. You know the name? Seraphina shook her head. He's good. Old school. Prefers to negotiate first, litigate second? He'll come at us with a meeting request before he files anything. Vivian looked up. You will not attend that meeting. I wasn't planning to. Good. Because the meeting is designed to read you. Webbs wants to know what you actually have before he knows what Julian actually told him. The gap between those two things is where we live. Seraphina thought about Julian's tablet. About the photographs on her phone backed up to 2 separate cloud accounts under email addresses Julian didn't know existed. The gap is wide, she said. Vivian nodded. Then we're in a reasonable position. She said reasonable, like another attorney might say excellent. Seraphina was beginning to understand that Vivian's language worked on a compressed scale. Reasonable was good. Good was very good. And she probably reserved excellent for moments that genuinely surprised her. The document fraud, Seraphina said. The signatures. That's the piece that concerns me most. For us or for them? For them, Vivian said. Which is why I'm concerned. A man who's concerned about exposure doesn't always stay rational. He doesn't always let his attorney run the play. He sometimes makes moves his attorney doesn't know about. She tapped the stack of papers and looked at Seraphina directly. You should not be staying anywhere he can find you. He doesn't know where I am. He doesn't know yet, Vivian said. There's a difference. Julian knew by Friday. Not her exact address. Not Cambridge. But he knew she'd left with Mara, and he knew Mara's last name. And Gideon had apparently handed that information to someone with a better research capacity than Julian's own assistants. And by Friday afternoon, Julian was standing in the lobby of Mara's office building because he'd looked up the address and driven there himself. Mara called Seraphina from the parking stairwell, voice low and sharp. He's downstairs. Seraphina felt something go cold in her chest. How does he look? Like someone who rehearsed being calm on the drive over and isn't sure the rehearsal held. A pause. He has flowers. Of course he does. What do you want me to do? Seraphina thought for 3 seconds. Go down. Talk to him. Don't tell him anything he doesn't already know, and don't let him know you're calling me. He's going to ask where you are. Tell him you don't know. Tell him you've been worried too. Make it true enough to carry. Mara was quiet for a moment. Sarah, I know, I'm sorry. Do it anyway. She heard Mara take a breath. Okay. The call ended. Seraphina sat in the Cambridge apartment and stared at her phone for 42 minutes until Mara called back. He stayed 20 minutes, Mara said. He asked about you 3 times. Once directly, twice sideways. What'd he say? He said he was worried. Said there'd been a misunderstanding that you'd left before he had a chance to explain, that he needed to find you to sort things out. Mara's voice carried something underneath it. Not quite contempt. Not quite pity. Something else. He looked tired, Sarah. Like he hadn't slept. He hasn't, Seraphina said. He doesn't sleep when he can't solve something. Do you feel no? Seraphina said, not right now. I can't. Mara accepted this. She had known Seraphina long enough to understand that not right now was not the same as never, and that pushing past it was like pushing on a door that opened the other way. He left the flowers with the front desk, Mara said. Peonies. Seraphina's mother had loved peonies. She'd told Julian that once in passing, and he had filed it away. The way he filed everything, not from tenderness, she now understood, but from the habit of a man who collected small details, the way other people collected leverage. She didn't say any of this. Throw them out, she said. The divorce petition went in on a Monday, and by Wednesday the city had opinions about it. Not loudly. Boston's financial community didn't work loudly. It worked over lunch and on golf courses, and in the kind of private clubs that weren't private enough to prevent information from traveling. The information that traveled was not complete. No one knew about the document fraud yet. No one outside Vivian's office knew what Seraphina actually had. But people knew the marriage had ended in the first month, which in certain circles carried a weight of its own. Julian felt it. He felt it in the way a Thursday meeting was rescheduled without explanation. In the way a partner he'd been courting for 3 months suddenly became unavailable. In the way Gideon walked into his office on a Friday morning, closed the door, and stood against it like he was blocking an exit. Bancroft pulled the refinancing discussion, Gideon said. Julian looked up from his desk. When this morning? No reason given. Just a call to my assistant, meeting canceled, we'll be in touch. Gideon's jaw was tight. It's the second one this week, I know. Do you know why? Julian set down his pen. I have a working theory. Is your working theory that your wife filed paperwork questioning the validity of half our corporate structure while you were busy bringing her flowers? The silence in the room had texture. Julian said carefully, What do you know about the paperwork? Marcus told me. Gideon moved away from the door and sat down, which he rarely did in Julian's office without being invited to. She's filing to remove her name from everything. Every guarantee, every board appointment, every authorization. Marcus says the argument is procedural, but that's not the play. The play is that once she's removed, someone's going to look at who replaced her as the authorizing party on those documents and realize the answer is nobody, because we never actually had her permission in the first place. Julian was quiet for a moment. Marcus can handle it. Marcus can respond to it. Gideon leaned forward. That's different. Handling it means it goes away. Responding to it means it becomes a record. Every motion she files, every response we generate, that's a paper trail. Julian and paper trails have a way of getting read by people we don't want reading them. So what do you want me to do? I want you to find her and talk to her. Gideon said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Before this gets bigger. Before Bancroft's people start asking around. You know what she knows, and right now what she knows is staying inside a lawyer's office. I want it to stay there. Julian looked at him. You want me to negotiate with my wife. I want you to negotiate with the woman who has enough documentation to make our lives very difficult, and the fact that she's also your wife is the only reason the conversation is possible. Gideon's voice was flat, not angry. More like someone who has already moved past the emotion and arrived at pure logistics. You had her number. You knew how she thought. Use it. Julian said nothing. Gideon stood up. The flowers were a nice touch, by the way, but she didn't come home. He left. Julian sat alone in his office for a long time after that, and the thing he kept thinking about, which he wouldn't have admitted to Gideon or anyone, was not the Bancroft meeting, or the paper trail, or the authorization documents. It was the 7 words on the cream card. I know. Good luck. And then her name. She'd signed it. Her full name. Seraphina, not Seraphina Moreau. Not the name she'd taken 3 days earlier. Seraphina Vale. Like the marriage had already been a past tense when she wrote it. Marcella Vale heard about the divorce petition from her mother. Vivian called on a Wednesday evening and delivered the information in the tone of voice she reserved, for things that were both significant and inconvenient, measured, precise, and carrying beneath it the specific kind of irritation that came from having to rearrange plans she'd already committed to. Your sister has filed, Vivian said. Marcella was standing at the window of her condo, wineglass in hand, watching the street below. I know. Julian called me this morning, and he wanted to know if I'd talk to her. Have you? No, Marcella turned from the window. Her mother was on speaker, and the sound of Vivian's breathing steady, deliberate, the breathing of a woman who had made difficult calculations for 50 years and found the process unremarkable, filled the room in a way that always made Marcella feel slightly too young. She's not taking my calls. She's not taking anyone's calls. A pause. The attorney she's retained is Vivian Cross. Marcella knew the name. Not well, but enough. That's not a good sign? No, Vivienne said. It's not. Cross doesn't take cases she can't win, and she doesn't define winning the way most people do. She defines it as making sure the other side loses something they can't recover. Another pause. Longer. What exactly did you send her, Marcella? It wasn't quite a question. The inflection was too flat for a question. Marcella took a sip of wine. A photograph of Julian, yes. Vivian was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was exactly the same, no louder, no sharper, but something in it had changed. A millimeter adjustment that Marcella had spent her whole life learning to read. Why? Because I wanted her to know. You wanted her to know, Vivian repeated. On her wedding night. Yes. Why that night, specifically? Marcella set the wineglass down on the windowsill, with more care than the action required. Because if I'd waited, she would have had time to get comfortable, to make it harder to undo. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. You understand, Vivienne said finally, that by accelerating this, you've created a situation where your sister is now working with an attorney instead of sitting in a bridal suite feeling sorry for herself. She would have found out eventually. Eventually is not the same as immediately, Marcella. Eventually, the documents would have been further along. The business would have been more insulated. There would have been a Vivienne stopped, recalibrated. The timing mattered, and you changed the timing. Marcella didn't answer right away. The truth, which she wasn't going to say to her mother on a Wednesday phone call, was that she hadn't sent the photograph because of strategy. She hadn't thought about insulation or documents or Vivian Cross. She'd sent it because she'd been standing outside that hotel with Julian's jacket still over her arm, watching the light in the bridal suite, and something that had been burning low in her chest for 4 years had suddenly needed somewhere to go. She'd wanted Seraphina to know. That was all. That it had consequences she hadn't calculated was a problem she was still getting used to. "I'll handle Seraphina," Marcella said. "How? By talking to her. She'll listen to me." Another silence. This one felt different, not weighted. More like Vivian, assessing whether to say the next thing. She apparently decided yes. Seraphina retained Vivian Cross 3 days after leaving Julian. She had already begun the process before she was fully out the door. That is not a woman who is waiting to have a conversation. A beat. That is a woman who has already decided. Marcella stared at the window. In the glass, faintly, she could see her own reflection. "She's my sister," she said. "Yes," Vivian said. "And right now, your sister is the single largest threat to a number of things that need to remain exactly as they are." The deliberateness in her voice was total. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Marcella understood. She didn't say so. She ended the call and stood in her quiet condo for a long time, and she thought about Seraphina on her wedding night, reading a message that had arrived as a photograph, and she tried to locate the feeling of regret, and found instead something that felt more complicated, more tangled, with grief in it somewhere that she couldn't separate from the anger and couldn't identify cleanly enough to name. Seraphina did not try to contact Marcella. She thought about it. At 2 a.m. on a Thursday, she sat up in the unfamiliar bed and typed Marcella into her phone and stared at the name for a while, and then turned the phone face down on the nightstand. What would she say? Everything she wanted to say was the kind of thing that could be used against her. Not in a legal sense, Vivian had been very clear about what she should and should not put in writing, but in the deeper sense, the sense that mattered more, words said in the right tone to the right person, had a way of traveling further than intended. Marcella would relay whatever Seraphina said to Vivienne, and Vivienne would relay the part she found useful to whoever she was protecting. Because that was what Vivienne did. She protected things. Not people, not exactly. Things, the structure of the family's finances, the arrangement of its reputation, the careful balance that kept certain doors open and certain rooms locked. Seraphina had never understood before now what she was part of by simply existing. She understood now. She lay back in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about her mother. Constance Vale had died in a car accident 3 years before Julian entered Seraphina's life. A wet road, a curve taken slightly too fast, a guardrail that failed to hold. The investigation had been brief, and its conclusion unremarkable. An accident, the kind that happened. The death of a woman who had been in every way a careful person, who did not take curves too fast, who had grown up driving in New England winters, and had never once, in Seraphina's memory, been anything other than precise. She had not thought much about that contradiction before. She was beginning to think about it now. It started as a feeling, the kind that doesn't have evidence yet, that lives in the body before it lives in the mind. A low-grade wrongness she couldn't point at directly. She didn't know what to do with it. She put it away. But it didn't stay put. The first meeting Julian's attorney requested was declined. The second, 3 days later, was declined with a letter from Vivian that was 4 paragraphs of polished legal language containing, beneath the polish, a clear message that any attempt to contact Seraphina directly or through intermediaries would be documented and treated as harassment. Marcus Webb, to his credit, did not escalate. What he did instead was file a counter motion, questioning the procedural basis of Seraphina's original resignations from the corporate boards. The argument was thin. Vivian said so, without much elaboration, in a way that suggested she found the thinness almost insulting, but it was sufficient to buy Julian's side approximately 30 days while the counter motion was reviewed. 30 days in which things changed. Gideon Russ called in 3 favors he'd been sitting on for 2 years and managed to restore the Bancroft meeting. The refinancing discussion resumed. 2 of the 3 partners who'd gone quiet reappeared. On the surface, the Moreau organization was holding. Below the surface, it was different. The authorizations Seraphina had flagged had triggered a quiet internal review at one of Julian's primary lenders. Nothing formal yet. Nothing with paperwork. Just a loan officer asking questions of a compliance officer, who asked questions of a risk manager who made a note that was filed and not yet acted on, but was there, waiting. Gideon knew about the note. Julian didn't yet, and Marcella was making it worse. She showed up at Julian's office on a Tuesday without calling. His assistant tried to redirect her. Marcella walked past the assistant with the fluency of a woman who has spent her whole life walking past people, deployed to stop her. Julian looked up from his desk, and his expression did a complicated thing, relief and calculation, and something that looked from a certain angle like shame. "You should have called," he said. "You should answer your phone." She sat down across from him without being invited and looked at his desk, the way she looked at everything like she was reading a document and finding it less interesting than advertised. "How bad is it?" "Manageable, that's not what Gideon says." Julian's jaw shifted. "Gideon talks too much. Gideon talks exactly the right amount to people he thinks need the information." She tilted her head. "He thinks I'm one of those people." "Are you?" "I'm trying to figure that out." She looked at him. "I sent her the photograph." "I know. I wanted you to know that I know it accelerated things." Julian was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was careful. "Why did you send it?" Marcella looked at him for a beat. "You know why. I want to hear you say it." She held his gaze. "Because I've been waiting for 4 years for you to make a choice, and instead, you made a completely different one. And I wanted her to know what kind of man she'd married before she had time to make it impossible to undo." The quiet in the office was different from the quiet when Gideon had been there. This one was warmer and more dangerous. Julian said, "What Seraphina has the documentation she pulled from my tablet. I know about the tablet. Then you know that if this goes further than the attorney's office, it's not just me who has a problem." His voice was measured, controlled. The voice of a man being deliberately careful about what he was saying and equally deliberate about making sure she understood what he wasn't saying directly. "Her name is on things. Yours isn't. But if the review goes deep enough, people will start asking who provided the supporting information for the Vale guarantees, who verified the family's financial standing independently, who told the bank that Seraphina had personally endorsed the arrangement." Marcella's face didn't change. "Someone did tell them that," Julian said. She looked at him. "And I have the email," he said. The room was very quiet. She left without the fight he'd been braced for. That was the part he replayed afterward, not what she'd said, but what she hadn't. She'd stood up from the chair, with the same composure she'd sat down in, picked up her bag, looked at him for 3 seconds longer than comfortable, and walked out. No counter, no denial, no you wouldn't. Which meant she didn't know if he would. Which meant she was going to Vivienne. Julian sat at his desk after she left, and thought about the email, a document he'd kept not as a weapon originally but as insurance, the way he kept most things, because information had weight, and weight was useful, and you never knew when you'd need something to balance the scales. He hadn't thought, when he filed it away, that the person on the other end of it would ever become a liability. He hadn't thought a lot of things. That was becoming clear. His phone rang. Gideon. He let it go to voicemail, which he never did, and Gideon called again immediately, which he only did when something had happened. He picked up on the third ring. "The lender's compliance team filed a formal review request," Gideon said. No preamble. Today, an hour ago, Julian felt something drop through the center of his chest. Which lender? Hargrove Capital. A pause. "They're looking at the Vale guarantees. All 3 of them." "That's Marcus can't do anything about a compliance review, Julian. That's not litigation. It's not a filing. It's not something you file a counter motion against. That's a bank deciding internally whether the basis for its loan agreements was legitimate." Gideon's voice was tight with the specific tension of a man who has been managing a problem that has just grown past his ability to manage it. If they determined the guarantees were improperly obtained. They weren't improperly. They were obtained using a signature that may not have been fully authorized, and you know that. A beat. If Hargrove pulls the loans, the Devereaux project goes with them. If Devereaux goes, we lose the performance bond on the Callaway build. If Callaway goes, I know the chain, then you know where it ends. Julian stood up from his desk and walked to the window and looked at the city the way he did when he needed to remember that it was still there, still organized, still operating on its own principles regardless of what was happening in his office. It usually helped. It did not help right now. "What do you need from me?" he said. "I need you to find your wife," Gideon said, "before Hargrove's review team finds those documents first." She didn't know about Hargrove Capital yet. That information would reach Vivienne's office the following morning, forwarded by a contact Vivienne maintained in the financial sector, specifically for situations like this one. The kind of contact you never mentioned in polite company and always kept very well compensated. What Seraphina knew on that Tuesday evening was something different. She'd spent the afternoon looking at photographs of her mother. Not grief photographs, not the ones from the funeral or the ones her cousin had compiled into a small album the year after. Old photographs, working photographs. The kind that showed Constance Vale in her professional life at board meetings, at the family trust's annual review, at a series of meetings with financial advisors that Seraphina had been too young and then too uninvolved to attend. In one photograph taken at what appeared to be a trustees' meeting, her mother was sitting across from a man Seraphina didn't recognize. The photograph was 8 years old. Her mother was mid-sentence, leaning forward slightly, and her expression was one Seraphina recognized. It was the expression Constance made when she had found something wrong and was in the process of saying so. Seraphina had that expression. She'd been told so most of her adult life. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in her mother's handwriting, small, slanted, the handwriting of a left-handed woman who had been made to write right-handed as a child and had never fully resolved the compromise, were 6 words. Ask Vivienne what she signed. Seraphina sat with that for a long time. Her mother had written those words on the back of a photograph and put it in a box with other photographs. And the box had been in storage for 3 years, and Seraphina had driven to the storage unit that afternoon, on an instinct she couldn't fully explain. Ask Vivienne what she signed. Not a note to herself, not a reminder. Written on the back of a photograph, in the way you write something when you're afraid of losing track of it and not sure yet where to put it. She turned the photograph back over. Her mother's face, mid-sentence, leaning forward, expression carrying the weight of something that needed to be said. Seraphina put the photograph in the envelope with the other documents. She called Vivienne. "I need to talk to you about something that isn't the divorce," she said when Vivienne picked up. A pause. "What kind of something?" "The kind that might be older than Julian." She looked at the photograph. "My mother found something. Before she died, I think she wrote it down." The silence on Vivienne's end was the attentive kind, not uncertain, just processing. "Come in tomorrow morning," Vivienne said. First thing Seraphina said. She hung up. In her chest, the low-grade wrongness she'd been carrying for days had settled into something harder and more specific, not a feeling anymore, but a shape. The outline of a question she didn't have the answer to yet, but could now for the first time articulate clearly. Her mother had been a careful woman who did not take curves too fast. And on the back of a photograph taken 8 years before she died, she had written a question about Vivienne Vale. Seraphina looked at the envelope. The careful woman had left something behind, for someone careful enough to find it. And now that someone had. Part 3, Vivienne's office at 7:30 in the morning, looked different than it did at normal hours. The overhead lights weren't on yet. Just the desk lamp and the gray morning coming through the window. And Vivienne herself in a different kind of suit than the one she wore for meetings, darker, simpler, the kind you put on when you're planning to work rather than to be seen working. She had coffee already. She didn't offer any, which Seraphina took as a sign that whatever Vivienne had been doing before she arrived had required full attention. Seraphina put the envelope on the desk. Vivienne looked at it without touching it. "Tell me first," so Seraphina told her. The storage unit, the box of photographs. The 6 words on the back of the one showing her mother at a trustees' meeting, 8 years ago, leaning forward with the expression of a woman in the middle of saying something that needed to be said. Ask Vivienne what she signed. Vivienne listened without moving. When Seraphina finished, she picked up the envelope, opened it, and looked at the photograph for a long time. Long enough that the silence in the room shifted from attentive to something else, something with more weight in it. "You said your mother died in a car accident," Vivienne said. 3 years ago. Wet road, a curve. The investigation was brief. Who ran the investigation? The county. It was treated as a straightforward accident. Vivienne set the photograph down. She looked at Seraphina with the expression of a woman who has just picked up a rock, expecting to find dirt and found something that moves. Who had oversight of the family trust at the time of your mother's death? Seraphina felt something tighten in her throat. Vivienne Vale. She was the co-trustee. My mother and Vivienne were co-trustees since my father died. And after your mother died, Vivienne became sole trustee, pending my formal inclusion, which requires she stopped. The shape of it arrived, all at once the way those things do, not gradually but in a single moment of awful clarity, which requires a formal review that I initiated 2 years ago, and that has been in procedural delay ever since. Vivienne was watching her. "The delay has a cause," Seraphina said. "It wasn't a question. Procedural delays in trust reviews have causes," Vivienne said carefully. "They don't always have innocent ones." She put the photograph back in the envelope. I want to make some calls before I tell you what I think this means. I need 24 hours. What do you think it means right now? Vivian looked at her steadily. I think your mother found something in the trust accounts. I think she wrote that note because she didn't know yet what to do with what she found. And I think the question of whether her accident was actually an accident is one that someone should have asked 3 years ago and didn't. The morning light through the window was flat and gray and very still. Seraphina picked up the envelope. 24 hours, she said. She didn't go back to Cambridge. She drove instead, without a destination, which was something she hadn't done since she was 22. And her father had just died, and she needed to be in motion. Because motion was the only thing that kept the grief from sitting down on her chest and making itself at home. Boston moved past the windows in its early morning arrangement. Delivery trucks, dog walkers, the first commuters, and she drove through it without seeing it. Her hands on the wheel and her mind somewhere entirely different. Her mother had been 53 when she died. Constance Vale had been, in Seraphina's estimation, the most deliberate person she had ever known. Not cold deliberate. There was a difference. She thought before she spoke. She read before she signed. She asked follow-up questions when other people accepted first answers. She had grown up in a family with money and had understood from an early age that money attracted a specific kind of carelessness in other people, and she had spent her adult life being the opposite of that. She did not take curves too fast. Seraphina pulled over on a side street in Brookline and sat with the engine running, and her hands in her lap, and thought about the last time she'd seen her mother alive. A Sunday lunch, the kind they did every few weeks, just the two of them. Marcella rarely came. Their relationship had been thorny since adolescence, and Constance had stopped pushing. They'd eaten at a restaurant Constance liked, with white tablecloths and good bread, and at the end of the meal, just before the check came, her mother had said something that Seraphina had filed away as odd, and then, in the grief of the weeks afterward, had misplaced entirely. She'd said, Sarah, if I ever send you something that seems strange, keep it. Don't question it. Just keep it. Seraphina had said, that's a strange thing to say. Her mother had smiled. Yes, keep it anyway. The check had come. They'd split it as they always did, because Constance found it important that both her daughters understood money as something you managed, rather than something that simply existed around you. They'd hugged outside the restaurant, and her mother had held on a beat longer than usual, and then let go and walked to her car and driven away. 6 weeks later, she was dead. Seraphina sat on the Brookline side street and understood finally and completely that her mother had known something was coming and had been trying, in the careful way she did everything, to leave a thread for someone to follow. The photographs in the storage box, the 6 words on the back of one of them, the note at lunch that Seraphina hadn't understood. The thread had been there. She just hadn't known to look for it. She put the car in drive. Daniel Mercer was not easy to find. He had been, for 11 years, a private investigator with a practice that occupied a small office in the South End, and a reputation that was passed person to person rather than advertised anywhere. He specialized in financial investigations, not infidelity cases, not missing persons, specifically financial, asset tracing, fraud documentation, the kind of work that required patience and a tolerance for reading documents for hours without visible result. He had retired 14 months ago, quietly, and moved to a rental house in Gloucester that he hadn't told most people about. Vivian found him in 48 hours. She called Seraphina on a Thursday morning. The 24 hours had become 48 without explanation, which Seraphina had taken as a sign that whatever Vivian had found required more than one call to process, and said, I need you to come in. And I need you to understand before you come that what I'm going to tell you is going to change the way you understand the last 3 years. Seraphina said, tell me now, in person, Vivian said. This isn't a phone call. She was right. Vivian had printed things out, pages, organized in a folder with the kind of tabbed structure that meant she'd been awake for most of the previous night putting it in order, deciding what came first, how to sequence information that did not sequence neatly into anything comfortable. She started with the trust. The Vale family trust, established by Seraphina's grandfather, had been a fairly standard arrangement for its era property assets, investment accounts, a small endowment for charitable purposes, managed by trustees with a set of guidelines about distribution and oversight. Her father had served as primary trustee until his death. Constance had then become co-trustee alongside Vivienne, per the succession provisions. Standard, clean, until approximately 9 years ago. 9 years ago, Vivian said, there were a series of transfers out of the trust's primary investment account, not large individually. Cumulatively, over 18 months, they totaled approximately $4.2 million. Seraphina sat across the desk and kept her face still. The transfers were authorized under a trustee signature, Vivian continued. The signature belongs to Seraphina Vale. The receiving accounts were corporate entities, 3 of them, registered in Delaware, with nominee directors. The entities don't appear to have any operating business. They were holding structures. What were they holding? At this point, hard to say exactly. The money moved again from those accounts, multiple times. It's been traced partially to real estate investments made through a structure that eventually intersects with a development company that Gideon Rusk was involved with before he partnered with Julian Moreau. The room was very quiet. Gideon, Seraphina said. The connection is not direct. It's layered, but it's there. Vivian opened to the next tab. Your mother began asking questions about these transfers approximately 10 years ago. She found the first discrepancy in a routine annual review. The trust's accounting firm, which Vivian had appointed, provided explanations that were technically sufficient. Your mother accepted them initially. A pause. She didn't accept them permanently. The photograph, Seraphina said. The note. She was building a record, quietly. The way she would have. Vivian stopped. The way a careful person would. And then she died. Vivian looked at her. Daniel Mercer was retained by your mother approximately 4 months before her death. She hired him to trace the transfers, gotten as far as the Delaware entities, and was beginning to identify the connection to the Rusk-adjacent structure when she died. Seraphina felt the blood in her hands go strange. Not cold, exactly something else. Like everything moving very deliberately. He stopped working the case after she died, Vivian said. He told me he stopped because his client was gone and because he became his word concerned. He said the accident happened at a location and time that he found statistically unlikely given what he knew about your mother's habits. He thought it wasn't an accident. He thought it warranted more investigation than it received. He didn't go to the police because he had no proof. He had a pattern and a feeling and a dead client, and none of that was enough. Vivian closed the folder. He kept his files. Seraphina looked at the folder. He'll meet with you, Vivian said. He called me back last night. He said, and I'm quoting him, that he's been waiting for someone to come looking. Gloucester in November was gray and salt-bitten and very serious about the cold. Mercer's rental house was 3 blocks from the water, a shingled cape with a porch that needed repainting and a truck in the driveway that had seen better decades. He answered the door before Seraphina knocked, which meant he'd been watching for her, which meant he took this seriously. He was 61, maybe 63, compact. The kind of man who had spent so many years looking at things carefully that his default expression was calibrated attention, not suspicious, not warm. Just present and watching and processing. You look like her, he said. Seraphina said, I know. He let her in. The house was organized in the way that suggested a person who lived alone and had made a specific peace with it, not messy, not obsessively neat, just arranged according to an internal logic that was consistent and personal. There was a file box on the kitchen table. He'd had it out already. He made coffee without asking if she wanted any and set a mug in front of her and sat across from her and put his hands flat on the table and said, How much has your attorney told you? The transfers, the Delaware entities, the Rusk connection, that you stopped after she died because you were concerned. He nodded. What she didn't tell you because I didn't tell her is what I found in the last 2 weeks before your mother died. Seraphina wrapped her hands around the mug. The Delaware entities were clean-looking, Mercer said. Good construction. Whoever built them knew what they were doing, not $100 online filing, actual legal architecture designed to withstand a surface review. But there's a thing that happens when you move money through multiple layers of holding structures, and you're trying to make it look like normal investment activity. The timing has to be consistent. Deposits, distributions, reporting it has to match the profile of a legitimate operation. And it didn't. It almost did. Almost is the word. There was a 6-week window 8 years ago where 3 distributions from the trust hit the Delaware accounts on dates that didn't align with any legitimate reinvestment pattern. Too fast. Like someone needed liquidity quickly and pulled the lever before the timing was right. He opened the file box and took out a single page, not a copy, the original slightly yellowed now. I traced one of those distributions. It landed in an account registered to a holding company called Aldrich Partners. The name meant nothing to Seraphina. She shook her head. Aldrich Partners has one signatory on file, Mercer said. Not Vivian, not Gideon. He pushed the page across the table. Seraphina looked at the name. The signature was Marcella Vale's. The mug was warm in her hands, and she focused on that. Just the warmth. The specific ceramic pressure of it. The way holding something gave your hands something to be doing while your mind did the other thing. Marcella had been 21 8 years ago. Seraphina calculated it without meaning to it. Was the kind of calculation her brain performed automatically, the habit of a woman who had spent years managing the practical details of a family that often needed someone to manage them. 21. Old enough to sign. Old enough to be used as a signatory if someone needed a name on an account that couldn't belong to the person actually controlling it. Did she know what she was signing? Seraphina asked. Mercer looked at her steadily. I don't know. I couldn't establish that before he stopped. Before things ended. Your best read. He thought about it. Genuinely thought she could see him going through it. The way an investigator goes through evidence. Not constructing an answer, but reviewing one. My best read is that she knew it wasn't a normal account. Whether she understood the full picture, the trust transfers, the structure, what the money was, I can't say. But Vivienne asked her to sign. The account was opened at Vivienne's direction. Yes. Seraphina set the mug down. She looked at the page. At her sister's signature in blue ink, slightly slanted, the looping M of Marcella's handwriting that Seraphina would have recognized anywhere because she'd watched her sister learn to make that letter at their kitchen table when they were children. My mother found this, she said. She found the Aldrich account, yes. Not the signature, I found the signature after she died. Mercer's voice was level, but not without something beneath it. She had found enough to know that Vivienne had been moving trust money. She had not yet found out how far Marcella's involvement went. If she had found out, she would have had to make a very difficult choice, Mercer said, about which way to go with it. Seraphina understood what he meant. Going after Vivienne meant pulling Marcella into it. And Constance Vale had spent 25 years making difficult choices about how much to protect her younger daughter from the consequences of her own decisions, and the last one might have been the one that killed her. Except it hadn't been a choice that killed her. Someone else had made a choice. She said it plainly, because there was no other way to say it. You think Vivienne had my mother killed? Mercer was quiet for a moment. I think your mother was 4 weeks away from having enough documentation to go to a trust attorney with a viable fraud claim, he said. I think she died before she got there. I think the accident occurred on a road she drove regularly, at a time when her schedule was predictable, in a way that was efficient and left nothing obvious to find. He paused. I think the people who know how to make those arrangements generally don't do it themselves. And I think Vivienne Vale has been managing complex arrangements for a long time. That's not an answer. No, he said, it's not. Because I don't have proof. I have a pattern and a file and a dead woman who hired me to find the truth, and I've been sitting on it for 3 years because I didn't know what to do with it that wouldn't get me the same result she got. He looked at Seraphina directly, until someone came looking. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind off the harbor moved through the bare trees with a sound like something being dragged. What do you have? Seraphina said. Exactly everything. He reached into the file box. He had payment records. 2 wire transfers from an account registered to a Cayman entity, to an individual whose identity he had traced through a secondary source, to a man named Patrick Riley, former law enforcement, had left the force under circumstances that were documented only as administrative, now worked as what different clients over the years had apparently described as a problem resolver. The transfers had occurred 6 weeks before Constance Vale's accident and 3 weeks after. Before and after. Before and after, Seraphina said. Standard arrangement, Mercer said, and the flatness in his voice when he said standard was a different kind of terrible. Half before. Half on completion. He had photographs. Riley at a location adjacent to the road where Constance died, 3 days before the accident. Time-stamped from a traffic camera, Mercer had pulled through a contact. Not conclusive, establishing. He had a phone record. 1 call, 40 seconds, from a number registered to an LLC that Mercer had traced back to Vivienne's personal attorney, to a number that Riley had used during that period. 1 call. 40 seconds, not conclusive. Not enough for a warrant. Not enough for a headline. Enough for a starting point. You need a sworn statement, Vivienne had said that morning. If Mercer's willing to give one, we can attach it to a petition to reopen the investigation. It won't be fast, it won't be easy, but it starts a record. Seraphina looked at Mercer. Will you give a statement? She said. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the file box. at the years in it, at whatever the weight of sitting on something this long does to a person who took the job to find truth and then found more than he knew what to do with. I'll give a statement, he said. But you need to understand what this opens. Tell me. When this goes on record, it won't stay quiet. Vivian has relationships in this city, legal, financial, social. She's going to know you're coming before you get there. And if she knows you're coming, he left the rest unfinished. She'll move, Seraphina said. She'll move on anything that can be moved. Money. Evidence, people. He looked at her, including Marcella. Seraphina thought about her sister's signature in blue ink on the Aldrich account document. Marcella's role was real, not a frame, not a fabrication, but a fact with her handwriting on it that a prosecutor would look at and see as participation. Whether it had been knowing or naive, whether Vivian had used her or recruited her, or something in between, none of that would matter in an initial review. What would matter was the signature, and Vivian knew the signature was there, which meant that if Vivian moved first, Marcella was not an asset to protect. She was a liability to manage. She'll use Marcella, Seraphina said. Not a question. She'll use whatever she has, Mercer said. It's been true her whole life. Seraphina drove back to Boston with Mercer's files in a sealed envelope on the passenger seat, and the particular kind of silence that comes after you've learned something that can't be unlearned. She thought about Marcella. She thought about the photograph sent at 12:38 in the morning. The wine glasses, the silk shirt, Julian's reflection in the mirror. She thought about how she'd felt in the first minutes after opening it, the specific cold shock of it. The way her hands had gone careful on the phone, like she was handling something fragile. She thought about calling Marcella and Marcella answering on the second ring. Calm, almost bored. She had read that calmness as cruelty. It was still cruelty. She wasn't revising that. But she was beginning to understand that Marcella existed inside a system that had been shaping her since she was 21 years old. When Vivienne had handed her a document and told her to sign it, and Marcella had signed it, because Marcella had spent her whole life trying to be the daughter Vivienne actually paid attention to. And Vivienne had paid attention, the kind of attention that looks like love if you're the one receiving it, and looks like something else entirely from the outside. It didn't excuse the photograph. It didn't excuse 4 years of an affair conducted in hotels, while Seraphina was 3 blocks away, living what she believed was her actual life. But it complicated the picture in a way that Seraphina was honest enough with herself to acknowledge, even sitting in a car in the dark with her mother's potential murder in an envelope on the passenger seat. She pulled over. She called Vivian. "I have everything," she said. "I'm ready to file." "I'll have the petition drafted by tomorrow morning," Vivian said. "Once it's filed, you should assume Vivian knows within 48 hours. Possibly sooner, I know. And Julian?" Seraphina had not thought about Julian in the last 6 hours. The realization sat strangely. He had been the entire architecture of her crisis 2 weeks ago, the reason for Cambridge and the payphones and the resigned board positions, and now he had receded to a secondary position, while something older and darker had moved to the front. "Julian's problem is still Julian's problem," she said. "We don't connect the cases. The Rusk connection connects them," Vivian said. "Gideon Rusk's financial history intersects with the Delaware entities. That means Julian's empire is downstream of the same fraud." "I know," Seraphina said, "but I'm not filing on Julian. I'm filing on Vivian. If Julian ends up in the blast radius because of Gideon's history, that's not my filing that does it." A pause. "All right, Vivian?" "Yes. Is there any version of this where I protect my sister?" The pause this time was longer, more honest in its length. "I don't know yet," Vivian said. "I'll think about it." She ended the call. Seraphina sat in the parked car in the dark and looked at the envelope on the passenger seat and thought about a 21-year-old girl signing a document she probably didn't fully understand at a table across from a woman who had spent 50 years understanding exactly what she was doing at every moment. She thought about Constance at lunch, holding on a beat longer than usual before letting go. She thought about 6 words in her mother's handwriting on the back of a photograph. Ask Vivian what she signed. Not, and this was the thing, the detail that had been sitting in the corner of Seraphina's mind since the storage unit, not what Vivian signed, not what I found. The question was directed at Vivian. Ask Vivian what she signed, not an accusation. A question. Her mother, even at the end, had left open the possibility that there was an explanation. Seraphina was no longer leaving that open. She picked up the envelope, held it for a moment, and then put it carefully in her bag. She had built a life on being careful, on being the kind of person who read everything before signing it, who asked follow-up questions, who believed that knowing where you were going was better than being surprised. She had inherited that from her mother, who had tried to be careful enough and had not survived it. The difference between them was that her mother had found the truth alone. Seraphina had Vivian. She had Mercer. She had a sealed petition sitting in a law office, ready to be filed in the morning. She had the photograph with 6 words on the back. And she had the particular kind of rage that comes not from being wronged, but from understanding the full shape of how long and how completely you have been underestimated by people who should have known better than to. Underestimate a woman who read the last page first. She started the car. Tomorrow, the petition would be filed, and the woman who had ordered her mother's death would open her morning newspaper and begin, for the first time, to understand what she had made. Part 4. The petition was filed at 9:04 a.m. on a Friday. Vivian hand-delivered it herself, which she said she never did, but which Seraphina understood to mean that she wanted to be certain it was in the right hands and time-stamped correctly, and that no copy went anywhere it shouldn't before the original was officially received. She called Seraphina at 9:22 with 2 words. It's in. Seraphina was sitting in the Cambridge apartment with cold coffee and Mercer's files spread across the kitchen table, and she said, "How long before it moves?" The petition requests an expedited review given the nature of the evidence. A judge will look at it today or Monday. If they grant the expedited status, the investigating authority gets notified within 72 hours. And Vivienne will know when her attorney tells her. That depends on how good her attorney's contacts are. A beat. Her attorney's contacts are very good. Assume 48 hours. Seraphina looked at Mercer's files, at the payment records, at the photograph of Patrick Riley near the road where her mother died. What does she do when she knows? She moves money she can move. She calls people who owe her. She constructs a version of events that positions her as a trustee who made good faith decisions and keeps Marcella in the foreground as the person who actually signed things. Vivian's voice was precise and entirely without sentiment. She has done this before. Not at this scale, but the mechanics are the same. So we have 48 hours. To do what? Seraphina had been thinking about this since Gloucester. Since the drive back in the dark with the envelope on the passenger seat. Since the specific moment when she'd understood that filing the petition was only the first move, and that the space between the first move and the outcome was where everything could still go wrong. "I need to talk to Marcella," she said. Vivian was quiet for 3 full seconds. "That's not something I can advise." "I'm not asking you to advise it." Seraphina, she has the Aldrich signature on her. Vivian is going to use that to redirect the investigation before it gets traction. If Marcella understands what's coming, if she understands that Vivian will sacrifice her to stay clean, she might give us something we don't have yet. Or she goes straight to Vivian and tells her exactly what you know and how much time you've given yourself. "That's possible," Seraphina said. "It's probable." Then I go in knowing it's probable, and I say only what moves her. Not everything, enough. She paused. "She's my sister. I know what moves her." Another silence. This one felt like Vivian making a calculation she didn't enjoy making. If you do this, you do it in a place that's neutral. Not her home. Not yours. Somewhere public enough that she can't make a call the moment you leave. I know. And you don't tell her about Mercer. I won't. Or the payment records. I won't. You tell her about the Aldrich signature, and you tell her that Vivian built the structure around her name deliberately, and you watch her face, and then you come back and tell me what her face did. A pause. "That's all." "That's all," Seraphina said. She called Marcella from a number. Marcella wouldn't recognize a temporary line Mara had set up 3 weeks ago for exactly this kind of contingency. Marcella picked up on the 3rd ring with the careful hello of someone answering an unknown number while trying to sound unconcerned. "It's me," Seraphina said. The silence that followed had several things in it. Surprise was one, something less clean was another. "Where are you calling from?" Marcella said. "Doesn't matter. I want to meet Sarah, not to fight. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it from me before you hear it from someone else." She kept her voice level, steady. The voice of a woman delivering information, not making an appeal. "There's a coffee place on Newbury, Barton's. You know it?" "Yes." 1 hour. She hung up before Marcella could build an excuse. Marcella was already there when Seraphina arrived. She was at a corner table with her back to the wall, which was either habit or instinct or both. And she had a coffee she wasn't drinking in front of her, and her coat still on, like she'd positioned herself to be able to leave quickly. She looked Seraphina took this in without reacting to it tired. Not the theatrical tiredness of someone performing difficulty, but the real kind. The kind that lives in the skin around the eyes and the set of the jaw and doesn't respond to concealer. Seraphina sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them said anything, and in that moment, Seraphina looked at her sister's face and found, against everything, something she hadn't expected to find. Not sympathy exactly. Recognition. The recognition of a woman who had been inside something larger than herself, for long enough that she'd stopped being able to see the edges of it. "You filed something," Marcella said. "Julian called me this morning. His attorney called him. Something about a petition." "The petition isn't about Julian," Seraphina said. Marcella looked at her. "It's about Mom," Seraphina said. The coffee cup in Marcella's hands didn't move. Her face didn't move. But something behind her eyes did a fast, deep shift, like a floor dropping half an inch. Barely visible. Visible enough. "What about Mom?" Marcella said. "Her accident." Seraphina kept her voice flat and even. Clinical. She'd decided on the drive over that emotion would make this a conversation between sisters, and she needed it to be something else right now. The investigation that closed without finding anything. "I've hired someone who looked at it more carefully and found things the original investigation didn't." Marcella set the cup down. "What things?" "Payment records. A man named Patrick Riley, who takes a specific kind of job for a specific kind of money. 2 payments before and after." She watched her sister's face. "Before and after Mom died." Marcella's jaw tightened. One small movement. She was controlling her face, and she was good at it. She'd always been good at it. Better than Seraphina in some ways, because Marcella had grown up in a different emotional climate and had needed the skill more. But her hands, flat on the table now, pressed down with slightly too much weight. "That's a serious accusation," Marcella said. "It's not an accusation yet. It's a petition to reopen the investigation." Seraphina leaned forward very slightly. "The payment records trace back to a source. That source traces back to someone who had access to the kind of account that could make that payment without it showing up as a personal expense." Marcella looked at her. "I need to say a name," Seraphina said, "and I need you to just listen." "A beat, Vivienne," Seraphina said. The silence in the coffee shop was full of other people's noise, steam wands and chair legs, and someone's laptop playing something soft. And inside that noise, Marcella Vale sat completely still across from her sister and did not say anything for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was stripped of everything except the basic mechanics of speech. "You're saying Vivienne had our mother killed. I'm saying the evidence points toward a chain of decisions that ends at Vivienne." "Yes." Marcella looked down at the table, back up. "Because of the trust." It wasn't a question. She said it's not with surprise, not with the careful blankness of someone hearing something new, but with the compressed weight of someone hearing something confirmed. Told Seraphina everything about what her sister already knew. "'Cause Mom found the transfers," Seraphina said, and she was close enough to proving what they were that it became a problem. Marcella's hand came off the table. She put it in her lap. She looked at the window. At the street outside, gray and ordinary, people walking past with their November faces on, the city operating as if this conversation was not happening inside it. "Marcella," Seraphina said. "The Aldrich account." Her sister's eyes came back. "Your signature is on it," Seraphina said. "I found it. An investigator found it 3 years ago and documented it. When this investigation opens formally, and it will open, it's already filed. The Aldrich account becomes part of the record." She held her sister's gaze. "Vivienne put your name on that account deliberately. Not because you were a partner. Because she needed a name that wasn't hers." Marcella said nothing. "She built it around you," Seraphina said. "And when this goes public, the first thing she's going to do is let that signature take the weight while she steps back." "You don't know that," Marcella said. Her voice was tight and thin, like something under pressure. "Tell me I'm wrong," Seraphina said. "Tell me Vivienne has ever, once in your life, taken responsibility for something when there was another option." The coffee shop steamed and hummed around them. Marcella didn't tell her she was wrong. She didn't commit to anything at the table. She stood up after a while, put her coat on, looked at Seraphina with an expression that was several things at once not readable as a single emotion, more like watching someone stand at a door they haven't decided whether to open, and said, "I need to think." "You have about 36 hours before it doesn't matter whether you've thought about it," Seraphina said. "When Vivienne finds out the petition is in, she's going to move. Everything she can move. Including you. I said I need to think." "I know." Marcella walked out. Seraphina sat with the untouched coffee for 7 more minutes, going over every beat of the conversation, checking for what she'd said and what she'd held back and whether the calculation had been right. She thought it had been. She thought Marcella's face, in the moment after the Aldrich account came up, had been the face of a woman recognizing something she'd been trying not to look at directly for years. Whether that recognition translated into action was a different question. She walked out of Barton's into the cold and called Vivian. She knows about the Aldrich account, Seraphina said. She didn't deny it. Did she react to Vivienne? She didn't say anything. But she knew about the trust transfers already, not the details, the fact of them. She's been sitting on that. How long? Long enough that it wasn't new information. Seraphina turned up her collar against the wind. She might call Vivienne the moment she gets in her car, or she might not. We operate as if she did, Vivian said. From this moment, agreed. I've received a call from Marcus Webb, Vivian said. Julian's attorney. He wants a meeting, not negotiation information exchange. He's saying Julian has material relevant to the trust investigation. Seraphina stopped walking. What material? Gideon Rusk's financial records from 8 years ago. Apparently, Gideon kept documentation of the Delaware entity transactions, his own records, separate from the corporate filing, the kind of thing you keep as insurance when you're working with someone you don't fully trust. Julian found them. A pause. Julian is offering them. In exchange for what? Webb was vague. He said Julian's position is that he wants to resolve his exposure and that he believes cooperation serves everyone's interests. Seraphina stood on the Newberry Street sidewalk in the cold, and she thought about Julian in his office reading about the petition and understanding, finally, what the blast radius looked like. She thought about the man who had married her for her name and used her signature and left her on their wedding night to fasten his watch in a mirror. She thought about Gideon Rusk's files. She thought about what those files would do to the investigation if they were in Vivian's hands. Tell Webb we'll hear what he has, she said. Not a meeting, a document exchange. No conversation, all right. And Vivian. She started walking again, fast into the wind. Whatever Julian wants in return, we don't give him anything he didn't already have. Clean. Just clean. The document exchange happened that afternoon in Vivian's conference room, with Marcus Webb on one side and Vivian on the other, and a paralegal present as a witness and no one else. Seraphina waited in an anteroom. She could hear the low register of voices through the wall, but not the words. And she sat in a chair that was slightly too upright to be comfortable, and looked at her phone, and did not read the messages on it because her hands needed to be still. She'd eaten a piece of bread at noon and nothing since, and she could feel it, the particular hollow alertness of a body running on adrenaline and insufficient fuel, the edges of everything slightly too sharp, and the center slightly too empty. She thought about her son. Not the son who existed yet. The son who existed in what she did not yet know was her future. That was still 11 days away. Still a pharmacy in a town she hadn't chosen yet. She couldn't think about something she didn't know. She thought instead about Constance. About a woman who had gone into a meeting with financial advisors and sat across from people managing her family's money and found a number that didn't add up and had been careful enough to start asking and brave. Enough to keep asking and had not survived the asking. And she thought, I am going to finish it. Not as a vow. Not dramatically. Just as a fact, the way you state the next item on a list. The door opened. Vivian came in alone and closed it and sat down across from Seraphina and put a folder on the table between them. Gideon's records are real, she said, and they're detailed. He was thorough, more thorough than the people he was documenting anticipated. He has transaction records, internal memos, correspondence between the Delaware entities and the Rusk-adjacent structure going back 9 years. She opened the folder to the first page, and he has something else. Seraphina looked at the page. It was a letter, internal, written from one party in the Delaware structure to another, regarding the Vale trust transfers, discussing their legitimacy, discussing the risk of Constance Vale's ongoing inquiries, recommending in the language of someone who believed themselves to be speaking privately that the situation be resolved definitively. The letter was dated 6 months before Constance died. The signature at the bottom was Vivienne Vale's. The room was very quiet. Seraphina read the letter twice. The language was careful, resolved, definitively was not a direct instruction, was not something you could put in front of a jury and say this is an order, but the context built around it in Gideon's accompanying documents made the meaning unmistakable. The letter existed inside a chain of communications that included the payment records Mercer had found, the Aldrich account documentation, the timeline of Constance's investigation, and the date of her death. Alone, it was arguable. Inside the full package, it was devastating. This is enough, Seraphina said. It's enough to sustain the investigation, Vivian said. It's enough to justify a formal criminal referral. It's not a conviction that takes longer and requires more, but it opens the door all the way. When does it go to the investigating authority? I'll file the supplemental documentation today. Combined with what we already submitted this morning, the expedited review will move. I expect action within 72 hours. 72 hours. Seraphina did the calculation automatically. Vivian had perhaps 48 hours before she knew the petition was in. Subtract the time already elapsed, and there was maybe 18 hours before Vivian's attorney called her, and the machinery began to move on that side. 18 hours. What does she do with 18 hours? Seraphina said. She moves what's movable, calls what's callable. Vivian closed the folder, and she calls Marcella. Seraphina's phone buzzed on the table. She looked at the screen. It was Marcella. She answered it in the hallway outside Vivian's office, standing against the wall with one hand pressed flat against the plaster, like she needed to feel something solid. "Where are you?" Marcella said. Her voice was different from the coffee shop, not thinner, denser, like something had been added to it in the last 3 hours. "Near downtown." "Why? Because I went to see Vivian." Seraphina's hand pressed harder against the wall. "What did you tell her?" "That you'd filed something. That you'd talked to me." A beat. She already knew. Her attorney had called her 2 hours before I got there. "What did she say?" "She said you were making accusations you couldn't substantiate to destabilize the family trust in the context of your divorce. She said the petition would be dismissed." A pause. A very specific kind of pause. The kind that carries weight it hasn't released yet. And then she said something else. Seraphina waited. She said that the Aldrich signature would be the central issue if anything went further. She said that as the person who signed, I was technically the authorized party, and that any transactions through that account would be attributed to the signatory under the law. "She's positioning you as the responsible party, yes." Marcella's voice was flat now. Flat in a way that had rage underneath it. Seraphina could hear the distance between the flatness and the thing beneath it, the specific register of a woman who has just had something confirmed that she spent years hoping was wrong. "She told me I should retain a separate attorney immediately, for my own protection." "She's cutting you loose," Seraphina said. "She gave me the name of the attorney," Marcella said. "Her attorney's former partner. Someone she can manage." Seraphina closed her eyes for 3 seconds. She opened them. "Marcella, listen to me very carefully. Do not retain that attorney. Do not retain anyone Vivian suggests or approves. Do you understand? I understand a beat. What do I do? Come to Vivian's office now. Tonight. And then what?" Seraphina thought about the letter in Vivian's folder, about Gideon's documents, about the full shape of what they had now, how tight it was, how far it reached. She thought about Marcella at 21, sitting across from Vivian. Signing something she probably understood less than she should have, because Vivian had spent years making sure Marcella felt like she needed Vivian's approval to understand anything at all. "And then you tell us everything," Seraphina said. "Everything you know. Everything you signed. Everything she told you and everything she didn't. You give us all of it, and Vivian finds a way to use it that protects you as much as the facts allow." Silence. "As much as the facts allow," Marcella repeated. "I'm not going to lie to you about what the facts are," Seraphina said. "The Aldrich signature is real. Your involvement is documented. What we can argue is the degree what you knew, what you were told, what Vivian withheld. That's a different case than the one she's trying to build on you." "You'd do that," Marcella said, "for me." Seraphina thought about the cream card on Julian's pillow, about the wedding ring in a drawer in Cambridge, about her mother's handwriting on the back of a photograph, about every careful thing Constance had done and not survived. "Mom would have," she said. "I'm trying to figure out how to do the same." Marcella didn't answer for a long moment. 40 minutes, she said. "I'll be there." She was there in 35. She came in with her coat on and her eyes dry, and an expression that had closed itself against anything she couldn't control right now. And she sat across from Vivian and Seraphina at the conference table, and she talked for 2 hours. She talked about Vivian approaching her when she was 21, 6 months after their father died, when the family's financial structure was in a period of reorganization, and Marcella had been in the particular vulnerable state of a young woman who had just lost the parent who understood her least and was being managed by the parent who understood her needs best, which was Vivian's greatest skill, understanding what someone needed, and making herself the only source of it. She talked about the Aldrich account. She'd been told it was an investment vehicle for a portion of the trust assets, that her signature as a family member added legitimacy to the structure for regulatory purposes, that it was a formality. She had believed this. She had wanted to believe it. She was 21, and Vivienne was the person she trusted most in the world, and the document had been put in front of her at a restaurant over a long lunch, and she had signed it. She talked about subsequent years, other documents, other signatures, fewer but present. Things she'd been told were administrative. Things she'd signed because questioning Vivienne felt, for a very long time, like questioning the ground itself. And she talked finally, in a voice that had completely dropped the flatness, and was now something rawer and harder to listen to, about her mother. She had not known she said it, and Seraphina watched her face and believed it, and knew Vivienne was watching too, and drawing the same conclusion. She had not known about Patrick Riley or the payments or the road, but she had known that Vivienne had been increasingly anxious in the months before Constance died. Anxious in Vivienne's way, which did not look like anxiety in a normal person, but rather a kind of cold precision, a sharpening of attention, an increased interest in knowing exactly where people were and what they were doing. She had noticed it, she had not understood what it meant. After Constance died, she had understood it differently, had filed it somewhere deep and dark, and had not looked directly at it. You knew, Seraphina said quietly, not as an accusation, as a statement of what Marcella had just told them. I didn't know, Marcella said. I suspected something. I didn't let myself know. The difference between those two things was real and also insufficient, and both of them understood that. Vivienne had been taking notes throughout. She set her pen down when Marcella finished and looked at both of them across the table with the expression of a woman who has been handed a complicated instrument and is calculating precisely how to use it. Here's what we have, Vivienne said. We have enough to support the criminal referral on Vivienne for fraud, and combined with Mercer's evidence, potential conspiracy relating to your mother's death. Marcella's account of the Aldrich signature and the manner of its execution supports a diminished culpability argument, coercion, informational manipulation, undue influence. That's not a guarantee, but it's a real argument. What does she need to do? Seraphina said. She needs to give a formal statement. Tonight, if possible, before Vivienne moves on anything, and she needs to be willing to testify. Marcella's hands were flat on the table. She looked at them. At Seraphina against Vivienne. Against Vivienne, Vivienne said. The conference room was still and fluorescent and entirely without comfort. Marcella looked at her hands for a long time. Vivienne called me her most capable daughter, she said. For 20 years she said that. Every time I did something she wanted. Her most capable daughter. She paused. She doesn't have daughters. She never had daughters. She looked up. She had people she was managing. Vivienne picked up her pen. Tell me what you need me to say, Marcella said. At 11:47 that night, Vivienne Vale's attorney called Vivienne's office line and left a message indicating that his client wished to arrange a meeting to discuss the matter of the petition filed that morning, and that she was prepared to provide documentation, clarifying the nature of the Vale Trust transactions. Vivienne listened to the message twice. Then she called the investigating authorities' night contact and told them that a material witness had provided a formal statement, that documentary evidence had been supplemented, and that they should expect a call from Vivienne Vale's attorney in the morning attempting to negotiate terms before a formal investigation could begin. The night contact said they understood. Vivienne locked her office at midnight and told Seraphina, who had been waiting in the anteroom since 9, that it was done. Is it enough? Seraphina said. To open, Vivienne said. Yes, to finish that's a longer road. Seraphina stood up. She put on her coat. She picked up the envelope Mercer's files, now supplemented, now part of an official record, and held it for a moment. Vivienne is going to move tonight, she said. She's already moving, Vivienne said. She's been moving since her attorney called. Can we stop her? We can make it harder for her to land anywhere clean. Vivienne looked at her. The financial side, the trust transfers, the Delaware entities, those are already flagged with the bank regulators through the petition. Moving money at this point creates a record that works against her, not for her. A pause. She knows this. Then what does she do? She calls in every relationship she has. Every person who owes her, every official who has taken something from her over 30 years, every board member, every donor, every contact in every firm that has ever worked with the Vale family. Vivienne picked up her briefcase. She tries to make the investigation disappear before it officially begins. Can she? Vivienne considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. 3 days ago, possibly. Tonight she paused at the door. Tonight you have Marcella's statement, Gideon's document, Mercer's files, the Aldrich records, and a letter signed by Vivienne herself recommending that a problem be resolved definitively. She looked at Seraphina. She needed to move before any of that existed. She didn't move fast enough. Because she didn't think I'd find it, Seraphina said. She didn't think you'd look, Vivienne said. She turned off the office light. In the dark hallway, Seraphina stood with the envelope against her chest and thought about a woman who had spent 50 years being certain. She understood exactly what people were capable of, and who had looked at a quiet girl in an ivory dress and seen someone who would not look too closely at anything uncomfortable. She had been wrong about the dress. She had been wrong about the girl. And tomorrow morning, when the investigating Vivienne's supplemental authority received Vivienne's supplemental filing, the phone in Vivienne Vale's house began ringing with calls she would not be able to answer the way she had always answered them. The woman who had built an empire on being certain she was always the most dangerous person in any room was going to understand, for the first time, that she had made a fatal error of judgment. She had underestimated what a woman would do when you took her mother from her. Seraphina walked out of the building into the cold night air and looked up at the sky and breathed. Tomorrow was not the end, but it was the beginning of the end, and she had built it herself, piece by piece, in the weeks since a cream card on a pillow and a wedding ring left behind, and a city receding through a car window. She started walking. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she did not check it yet. Because for 30 more seconds she wanted to be exactly this, a woman alone on a dark street who had done what needed doing, and was still standing, still breathing, still entirely herself. And she checked it. It was Mara, 4 words, turn on the news. Seraphina stopped walking. She found a news alert on her phone, a local outlet, updated 12 minutes ago, and read the headline twice to make sure she'd read it correctly. Vale Family Trust investigation opens. Prominent Boston figure sought for questioning. Vivienne had moved faster than she'd said. Or someone else had moved first. Seraphina stood on the dark street with her phone in her hand and the cold on her face, and understood that the next 24 hours would be the ones that decided everything, not just Vivienne, not just the trust, not just her mother's death, but the full shape of what came after. And she was the only one standing in the right place to make sure the shape was the one she intended. 5. The news alert was 47 words long, and it changed everything and nothing at the same time. Seraphina stood on the dark street and read it again, and understood that someone inside the investigating authority had moved before the official 72-hour window, had looked at the supplemental filing and the Mercer documents and the letter, signed by Vivienne, and had decided that waiting until morning created a risk they weren't willing to carry. Someone had made a call, and that call had become a headline at 11:58 p.m. on a Friday night, which meant by morning it would be on every platform, in every feed, attached to a name that had been in Boston's financial and philanthropic circles for 30 years. Vivienne Vale sought for questioning. Seraphina called Vivienne. "I saw it," Vivienne said before she could speak. "I didn't authorize the release. Someone inside leaked it. Does it hurt us?" A pause. The calculating kind. "It accelerates things. It means Vivienne can't manage the narrative before the public record exists. It also means her attorney will file an emergency motion by 6 a.m. claiming prejudicial publicity and requesting a delay, a beat, which we will oppose. And Marcella's statement, sealed per the agreement. Her name stays out of the public record until the formal proceeding." Another pause. Seraphina. "Vivienne is going to know by midnight that the leak happened. She's going to know the statement came from someone inside the family. There are only so many people who could have provided the level of detail in that petition. She'll go to Marcella. She'll try. Marcella should not be home tonight." Seraphina was already moving, already calculating, already 3 steps ahead in the way she'd been operating for the past 3 weeks. "I'll handle it." She called Marcella from the same temporary line. Marcella picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd seen the alert too, which meant she was sitting somewhere with her phone in her hand and her coat still on, and the specific section Seraphina had seen at Barton's, the one that was processing something too large for a single emotion. "You need to leave your place tonight," Seraphina said. "I know. Can you go to someone Vivienne doesn't have access to?" A pause. "There's a friend. From college. Vivienne never liked her, which means she never kept track of her. Something that might have been a short, dry exhale. I'll go there. Take what you need for 2 days. Don't tell anyone where you're going except me, Sarah." Marcella's voice shifted. Not softer exactly. More like the layer above the real thing had thinned enough to let the real thing through. "I'm sorry, I know it doesn't cover it. I'm saying it anyway. Seraphina stood on the sidewalk in the cold and thought about 4 years and a photograph at 12:38 in the morning and the way Marcella had answered the phone that night, calm, almost bored, and she thought about a 21-year-old girl signing a document she didn't understand across a lunch table from a woman who understood exactly what she was doing. Both of those things were true simultaneously. "Go to your friends," Seraphina said. "We'll talk when this is over." She meant it. She wasn't sure yet what the talking would look like or what it would resolve, or whether sorry was a door or just a word. But she meant the intention. She hung up and kept walking. Vivian Vale was taken in for formal questioning at 7:14 the following morning. Seraphina wasn't there. She was in Vivian's office, which by 7 a.m.'s had the specific atmosphere of a room where people had been working, since before the sun came up, cold coffee, jacket over a chair, the overhead lights doing their flat institutional best against the gray morning coming through the windows. Vivian had a contact at the investigating authority who sent a one-line text when it happened. She came in voluntarily. Attorney present. Seraphina read the text and set her phone face down on the table and sat with it for a moment, voluntarily. Because showing up voluntarily, with an attorney and a prepared position, was how Vivian Vale had operated for 50 years, always ahead of the pressure, always appearing to cooperate, always making it look like the decision was hers. She had walked into that building the way she walked into every room she'd ever entered, like she had already decided how she was going to walk out. What she didn't know yet was the full scope of what was in the room waiting for her. She didn't know about Gideon's documents, which Julian had handed over through Marcus Webb, and which Vivian had incorporated into the supplemental filing, with the precision of someone who understood exactly where each piece fit. She didn't know that Mercer had agreed the night before to present his records in person to the investigating authority that morning that the retired investigator from Gloucester had driven down at 5 a.m. because he had been carrying this for 3 years and was done carrying it. She didn't know that the Aldrich account documentation, combined with Marcella's statement about the manner of its execution, had shifted the evidentiary picture from financial fraud into something that touched the criminal directly. And she didn't know about the second letter. Gideon's files had contained 2 letters, not one. The first, the one Seraphina had read in Vivian's conference room, recommending that the problem of Constance Vale's investigation be resolved definitively, was the one they'd filed. The second was older, written 4 years earlier, from Vivian to Gideon, detailing the original structure of the Delaware entities and their relationship to the trust transfers, and containing, in its 3rd paragraph, a direct acknowledgement that the funds being moved had not been authorized under the trust's governing documents. Not resolved definitively, not arguable language. A direct acknowledgement of unauthorized transfer, in her own handwriting. Vivian had held the second letter back from the initial filing deliberately, not to protect Vivian, but because introducing it at the right moment, after Vivian had given her initial account to the investigating authority, would be more damaging than presenting it up front. Vivian would construct her story around what she believed they had. Then the second letter would arrive, and the story would collapse against it. Seraphina had asked if that was standard practice. Vivian had said, "It's my practice." The call came at 11:30 that morning, not from Vivian's contact. From Seraphina didn't recognize, which she almost didn't answer, and then did because she'd been answering unknown numbers for 3 weeks and had not once regretted it. Ms. Vale. A man's voice, professional, the tone of someone who delivers information for a living and has learned to do it without inflection. "My name is Gerald Cho. I'm a senior investigator with the Financial Crimes Unit. I understand you are represented by Vivian Cross in the matter currently before us." "Yes," Seraphina said. "I wanted to inform you personally your attorney will receive the formal communication within the hour that Vivian Vale has provided an initial account that is materially inconsistent with the documentary evidence in our possession." A pause, the deliberate kind. "She has also, in the course of that account, made representations about her co-trustee's role in the 2015 through 2017 transfers that are directly contradicted by the documents you submitted." Seraphina was very still. "I want you to understand," Cho said, "that what was submitted on your mother's behalf, the petition, the supplemental filing, Mr. Mercer's records, this is a complete picture. We don't often receive cases this complete at the initial filing stage." Another pause. "I'm sorry it took this long." She didn't answer immediately. The apology was unexpected, and it landed in a place she hadn't prepared, and she had to take a breath and wait for the steadiness to come back before she could speak. What happens now? She said. The investigation proceeds formally. There will be additional questioning. The financial fraud component is clear and will move relatively quickly. The matter relating to your mother's death, a careful beat. That requires a parallel process, longer, more complex. But the foundation is there. He paused. I can't promise you a timeline. I know, she said, but I can tell you that we intend to pursue this completely. She believed him, not because she was naive. She'd spent the last 3 weeks learning exactly how compromised and navigable most institutions were, but because his voice carried the particular weight of someone who had looked at what she'd submitted and understood what it meant, that someone had died, that someone had made that happen, that it had stayed buried for 3 years because no one had pushed hard enough. She had pushed hard enough. Thank you, she said. She ended the call and put her phone flat on Vivian's conference table and looked at it for a long moment and then put her face in her hands. Not crying, not yet. Just inside her own hands in the dark behind her palms for 30 seconds. She came back out and looked at the window and the gray Boston morning beyond it and thought, Mom, I found it. Vivian was not arrested that day. The investigation moved, as Cho had said, formally and carefully, and without the drama of an immediate arrest, because the case had enough complexity that the prosecutors wanted it built correctly rather than quickly. Vivian was released after questioning with conditioned surrender of passport, regular check-ins, no movement of assets. Her attorney issued a statement. The statement was a masterpiece of vague denial, the kind of language that sounded like a rebuttal without actually rebutting anything specific, and Seraphina read it once and set it aside. She had expected exactly this. So had Vivian. It's not a sprint, Vivian said, over coffee that afternoon, real coffee, the first time she'd suggested anything that wasn't a working meeting. Financial fraud cases at this level take 12 to 18 months to prosecute fully. The parallel criminal investigation into your mother's death will take longer. Riley, Seraphina said. The investigators are looking for him. He's not. Vivian paused. He's not the type to disappear successfully for long. He has a pattern and he has known associates, and he left a financial trail that Mercer partially documented, a beat. He'll be found. Seraphina wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. And Marcella. Vivian looked at her steadily. Marcella's cooperation is documented and on record. The statement she gave, combined with the evidence of how the Aldrich account was structured around her signature, supports the diminished culpability argument strongly. A prosecutor looking at the full picture is going to be more interested in Vivian than in a 21-year-old who signed something she was misled about. A pause. That's my honest assessment. I can't guarantee it. I know. She'll need her own attorney. Not someone Vivian suggested. I'll help her find one. Vivian looked at her for a moment, not with surprise exactly. More with the particular attention of a woman who has watched someone carry a very heavy thing for a very long time and is noticing now that they're still standing. You're going to be all right, she said. Not as a question. Seraphina thought about it honestly. Ask me in a year, she said. Vivian almost smiled. For the second time. 3 days after Vivian's questioning, Julian Moreau called Seraphina's phone directly. She hadn't spoken to him since the bridal suite, since the cream card and the wedding ring and the flat champagne in the silver bucket. That had been weeks ago. And also, in the way that time does strange things, when everything in it is compressed and significant, it felt like a different country. She answered, because she had decided, somewhere in the last 72 hours, that there was nothing left he could do to her that the past weeks hadn't already inoculated her against. I heard, he said, I assumed. Gideon told me what he gave Vivian's office, a pause. I want you to know that I didn't know about your mother, about any of that. The Rusk connection to the trust structure I knew. Gideon had history with those entities, but I didn't know the origin of the money. She believed him. Not completely. Julian's self-knowledge had limits she'd seen up close, but she believed that this specific thing was true. He had built his empire on the back of money that had a terrible history and had not asked about the history because it had suited him not to ask, and that was its own category of culpability. But it was not the same as knowing. Okay, she said, a pause. He'd expected something different. That's all? What would you like me to say, Julian? He was quiet. I want to ask you something. And I want you to know that I'm asking it as someone who understands he doesn't have the standing to ask. She waited. Are you? He stopped, started again. Are you okay? She thought about the 30 seconds with her face in her hands in Vivian's conference room, about the drive back from Gloucester in the dark, about the storage unit and the box of photographs and 6 words in her mother's handwriting. I'm standing, she said. That's good. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not affection, not calculation. The bare sound of a person who has run out of performance. I'm sorry, for my part in all of it, not as a legal position. I'm sorry. She received the apology the way you receive something that comes too late to change anything, and too genuinely to dismiss entirely. You said it somewhere. You don't throw it away. You don't make it mean more than it is. The divorce will finalize next month, she said. Vivian says there's nothing that should complicate it further. No, he said. There isn't. Then that's where we are. She ended the call and stood in the Cambridge apartment that still smelled like someone else's life. And she knew it was time to stop staying in borrowed spaces. She found out she was pregnant. 11 days after leaving Boston the first time, in a pharmacy in a small town outside Providence, that she'd stopped in because she needed aspirin and had been running on bad sleep for a week, and something in her body had been trying to tell her something she hadn't been ready to hear. She sat in her car in that pharmacy parking lot for a long time. She thought about calling Mara. She thought about calling Vivian. She thought about calling Julian. And then she thought about the version of Julian who had married her because her name opened doors, and the version who had stood in a hotel room doorway, looking tired and fake, and the version who had just said I'm sorry in a voice that finally sounded real. She didn't know which version would come looking for a child, whether it would be the one who needed leverage or the one who'd run out of performance, whether there was a third version she hadn't met yet. She made the decision she thought she could defend. She drove north. She called Mara from the road and said, I need a different plan. Florence was not a plan she had made consciously. It became a plan because a contact of Vivian's knew a restoration firm there that needed someone with an eye for historical property and a willingness to work carefully without the need for constant recognition. And Seraphina had those qualities in abundance. And 3 months after leaving Boston, she was standing in a 14th century building in the Oltrarno district, looking at water damage on a frescoed ceiling, and understanding that she had accidentally found the version of her life that fit the actual shape of her. Theo was born in September. He was small and very serious from the beginning, with Julian's eyes and Constance Vale's expression, the one that looked at things with a particular focused attention, like it was doing math. Seraphina lay in the hospital bed with him on her chest and looked at his face for a long time, and thought about all the women who had preceded her in her family, the careful ones, the managing ones, the ones who had kept things intact through difficult circumstances and paid various prices for it. She thought, I am going to try to do this differently. Not perfectly. She had no illusions about perfect, just differently. 3 years passed. She did not disappear in the sense of hiding. She simply built a life in a place where her name was her own, and her past was her own history. And no one expected anything from her except the quality of her work and the accuracy of her judgment, and she was good at her work, and her judgment was accurate, and it turned out that was sufficient for a life. Theo learned to walk in a garden in Florence. He learned to say his first word in English and his second in Italian, and by the time he was 2 he mixed them freely and found this entirely reasonable. He loved wooden trains with an intensity that suggested the feeling was structural rather than passing. He had opinions about track configurations that he communicated with the seriousness of an engineer and the vocabulary of a toddler. She thought about Julian sometimes, not with longing. With something more complicated than longing, the way you think about a chapter of your life that contained real things, even if the real things were not what you'd thought they were at the time. She had told no one in Boston about Theo except Mara and Vivian. Mara had held this information with the same care she'd given everything else. Vivian had said in her compressed way, all right, when you're ready, and had not asked again. When the news about Vivian's formal indictment came 14 months after the petition, exactly the timeline Vivian had predicted, Seraphina sat on her terrace in the Oltrarno with Theo asleep inside and a glass of wine and the notification on her phone, and let herself feel the full weight of it. The financial fraud charges were extensive and well documented, and the outcome was not in serious doubt. The conspiracy charge relating to Constance Vale's death had taken longer. Patrick Riley had been found in New Hampshire, living quietly under a name he'd acquired from a man who no longer needed it. His arrest, combined with the payment records Mercer had documented, and the phone record, tracing back to Vivian's attorney's office, had built the case brick by brick in the deliberate way that cases built on careful evidence get built. He had taken a plea. His allocution detailed the arrangement, the payment, the road, the curve, the manner in which a woman who drove carefully had been placed in circumstances designed to make careful driving insufficient. Seraphina read the elocution once. Then she put her phone down and didn't pick it up again for 2 hours. Her mother had been right about everything she'd suspected. Had died knowing she was right, which was the worst version of being right that existed. But someone had followed the thread. She returned to Boston under her own name, which felt significant in a way she didn't try to articulate. Seraphina Vale, not Moreau. Not the name Julian had given her that she'd worn for less than a month. Her own name, the one her mother had given her, the one that had been used as a corporate tool and was now simply hers again, returned to its original purpose. She brought Theo. He was 2.5 and treated the airplane with the scientific interest he brought to most new things and fell asleep on her shoulder 40 minutes before landing. And she sat in the dark of the cabin with his weight on her arm and thought about what she was going back to. Vivian met her at her office the morning after she arrived. Theo sat on the carpet in the anteroom with a set of blocks someone had thoughtfully provided and assembled them with focused concentration while the two women sat across the desk and went through what remained. The Vivian sentencing is in 6 weeks, Vivian said. You'll have the opportunity to submit a victim impact statement. I know, you don't have to. I know that too. Seraphina looked at the desk. At the folder she recognized as the one that had started all of this thinner now, most of its contents having moved into official records. I'll submit one. Not for her, for the record, so it's there. Vivian nodded. Marcella's situation has resolved as well as it could have, given the facts. She received a formal censure related to the Aldrich account and agreed to full cooperation with the trust's restructuring. No criminal charge. A pause. I'm told she's been doing her own work on understanding what happened. Seraphina had spoken to Marcella twice in 3 years. Once on the phone briefly, in the first month a conversation that had been mostly silence, and the few words that could move through silence at that stage. Once, 6 months later, longer, harder, more real. They had not arrived anywhere that had a name yet. They were somewhere in the middle of a long road that Seraphina was not sure led to the same destination for both of them, but they were on it. She's coming to the sentencing, Seraphina said. I know, Vivian said. She called me. She called Julian herself. She had thought about asking Vivian to arrange it, or Mara, or some other intermediary, and then she had thought no. She had learned in the last 3 years that doing things through intermediaries was sometimes necessary and sometimes just a way of managing your own discomfort at the expense of clarity. She called him from the hotel room the night before she planned to go to his attorney's office. He answered on the second ring, Seraphina. He said her name the way you say the name of something you've been thinking about for a long time. I'm in Boston, she said. A pause I heard. About the sentencing. I need to talk to you. Not about Vivian. About something else. She heard him breathe. Tell me. Not on the phone. She looked at the window, at the Boston skyline she'd grown up since inside, familiar and altered and still fundamentally itself. Tomorrow afternoon, I'll send you an address. I'll be there, he said. No negotiation. No maneuvering. She sent him the address of a house on the outskirts of the city, a rental she'd arranged through Mara, a small place with a garden. Nothing significant about it, except that it was quiet and had a patch of grass where a 2.5-year-old could push a wooden train without running into anything. He was standing outside when she arrived. She saw him from the car and took a moment before getting out, just a moment, just enough to look at him with the distance of 3 years and see what the distance had done. He was thinner than she remembered. The controlled quality she'd always associated with him, the careful posture, the managed expression was still there but different, like a coat that no longer fit quite right, like he'd been wearing it so long. He'd forgotten how to take it off, but had started to wonder if he should. He saw her get out of the car. Then he saw Theo. She watched his face. She had thought about this moment in the abstract, had prepared for versions of it: anger, demand, the reflex toward control that was Julian's default response to things he hadn't anticipated. She had prepared for the version of him who would immediately start calculating. The version she got was not that version. He went absolutely still. Theo, indifferent to the weight of the moment, walked across the garden toward a stick he'd identified as interesting and crouched down to examine it with the methodical attention he gave everything. Julian watched him, and his face did something. She had no prepared category for it. Opened was the only word. Not broke. Opened, like a room that had been closed for a long time, and someone had finally found the door. She walked to him. She stopped 2 feet away. His name is Theo, she said. Julian looked at her. His eyes were bright in a way that wasn't clean. How old? 2.5. His birthday is in September. He did the math. She watched him do it. Watched him arrive at the number that told him how long ago. What circumstances? What version of his life this had emerged from? You knew when you left, he said. I found out 11 days after. I didn't know when I left. He looked back at Theo. Why didn't you tell me? She had prepared this answer too, had turned it over many times, had tried to make it fair without making it false. Because I didn't know which Julian would come looking, she said. The one who needed a veil in his corner, or the one who was actually his father. He received this without defending against it, which was new. Which one is here now? She said. He looked at her. Then at Theo, who had abandoned the stick and was now examining a different stick with equal seriousness. I don't know yet, he said. I'm trying to find out. It was the most honest thing she had ever heard him say. She called Theo's name, and he looked up and she said, Come here, baby. And he came trotting across the grass with the stick still in his hand and stopped in front of Julian and looked at him with the direct, unself-conscious assessment of a child who hasn't learned yet to make looking polite. Julian crouched down to his level. Hi, he said. Theo looked at him. Hi, pause. That's my stick. I can see that, Julian said. It's a good one. Theo considered this. Yeah, he said, and held it out for Julian to look at more closely, and Julian looked at it with the gravity the gesture required, and something that had been wound very tight in Seraphina's chest loosened by one small degree. The weeks that followed were not a reconciliation. She had been clear about that, with herself first, and then with Julian, who had accepted the clarity without argument. Theo came first. That was not a principle, she stated. It was the organizing fact of every decision she made. Julian's access to his son would be built slowly, on Theo's terms, in Theo's time, without the pressure of what it meant for the adults involved. The first visit lasted 40 minutes, the second an hour, then another. Seraphina did not say for them. She dropped Theo off and went to a coffee shop or a park or Vivian's office, and she let Julian begin the work of learning who his son was from the only position available to him the beginning, starting from nothing, earning it. She attended Vivian's sentencing. She sat in the courtroom in a gray suit and watched a woman who had spent 50 years being certain. She was the most capable and dangerous person in any room she entered, sit at a defense table and look at her hands while the judge read the charges. Vivian's posture was still precise. Her expression was still managed. But there was something around the edges of her that had changed, something that happens when the room you're in finally contains people with more power than you, and you've spent so long believing that couldn't happen that you have no prepared response for it. The sentence was significant. The fraud charges alone carried weight. The conspiracy charge, the one that connected the payment records, and Patrick Riley, and a wet road, and a curve taken by a careful woman under circumstances designed to be fatal, carried the rest. Vivian looked up once, from the defense table. She looked at Seraphina. Seraphina held her gaze, and did not look away, and did not give her anything, not hatred, not satisfaction, not the specific acknowledgement that would have let Vivian make this about the two of them, about a personal war. It was not personal. It was a woman who had done a terrible thing and had been found out and would now live with the consequences. That was all. Marcella was 3 rows behind her. After the sentencing, they walked out of the courthouse into the November cold and stood on the steps and looked at each other, and neither of them said anything immediately. There was too much for any sentence to hold without collapsing under it. Marcella said, finally, she never thought you'd come back. I know, Seraphina said. She told me once that you were the kind of woman who retreated. A pause. She said it like it was a fact. Seraphina looked at the street. At the ordinary morning, continuing beyond the courthouse steps. She was looking at the wrong woman, she said. Marcella made a sound that might have been a laugh, and might have been something that needed to be a laugh, because the alternative was too heavy. Yeah, she said. She was. They stood there a moment longer in the cold. 2 sisters on courthouse steps, carrying between them a history that included love and betrayal and absence, and a mother who had died trying to protect something she'd believed was worth protecting. I want to meet him, Marcella said. Theo, when you're ready. Seraphina thought about it. About the kind of Aunt Marcella might be imperfect, complicated, carrying her own weight of things she'd done and hadn't done, and wished she'd done differently. She thought about whether that was something she was willing to add to her son's life. She thought about her mother, choosing always to leave the door open. When I'm ready, Seraphina said. It was not yes. It was not no. It was the truth of where she was. Julian brought Theo a wooden train on his 4th visit, not a generic one. A specific one, Baltic birch, hand-finished, the kind that required some research to find. The kind that Seraphina's had learned took 30 seconds to establish was the right quality because Theo would turn it over and examine the wheels before accepting it. Theo examined the wheels. He looked up at Julian. "Okay," he said, and went to find the tracks. Seraphina was at the door with her coat in her hand, not planning to stay, and she stopped for a moment and watched Julian sit down on the floor in the middle of the living room and accept the section of track Theo handed him without instruction. Theo said, watching him try to connect it. "Wrong." "Show me," Julian said. Theo showed him. Julian did it the correct way. Theo evaluated the result and appeared to find it acceptable and handed him another piece. Seraphina watched for 40 seconds, then she put on her coat and left. She walked down to the corner and stood in the cold and looked at the sky and thought about everything that had happened in the 14 months since a news alert on a dark street had changed the direction of everything she'd already set in motion. She thought about Vivian filing papers in the early morning, about Mercer driving down from Gloucester at 5 a, because he'd been carrying something too long, about Marcella's voice on the phone saying, "I need to think," and then coming anyway. She thought about her mother at a restaurant, holding on a beat longer than usual before letting go. She didn't cry, standing on the corner. She wasn't suppressing it. She'd cried, in private, in all the moments that had warranted it, and she'd learned to let those moments be what they were, rather than carrying them around, looking for the right place to put them. What she felt on the corner was something quieter, something that didn't need a name but was related to what it felt like when a weight you'd been carrying for so long you'd stopped noticing. It was finally, partially, distributed differently. Not gone. The weight didn't go. Her mother was still dead. Theo still didn't know the full shape of the world he'd been born into. Marcella was still a question she hadn't answered. Julian was still the man who had married her for her name. All of that was true and remained true, and she was still standing. She walked back to the house. She came through the door and Julian looked up from the floor, and Theo didn't look up because he was deeply invested in a section of curved track that wasn't cooperating, and Julian got up from the floor and picked up his jacket and said quietly, so Theo wouldn't hear, "Thank you." She nodded. He took something from his jacket pocket, her wedding ring. He held it out, not insistently, just held it, the way you hold something that belongs to someone else, and you've been carrying for them, and you want to return, without making it a statement. She took it. She looked at it for a moment. The metal was cold and smooth and entirely familiar, and also completely foreign, like something from a house she used to live in. She put it in her own pocket. "Mommy." Theo's voice from the floor, not looking up. "Come fix this." She went to him and crouched down and looked at the track section he was fighting with and saw immediately what the problem was: 2 pieces misaligned at the connector, simple fix, and she pressed them together until they clicked. Theo evaluated the repair. "Good," he said, and moved on to the next section. She stayed crouched for a moment, hand on the track, looking at her son's concentrated face, the way he worked the problem by looking at it until it made sense, the patience of him, the seriousness, the complete confidence that if you looked long enough the thing would come clear. She thought, "He gets that from you, Mom." She stood up. Julian was at the door, coat on, the goodbye of a man who is learning that every time he leaves and comes back matters, and so is trying to leave well. "Bye, Theo," he said. Theo looked up, evaluated. "Bye, Dad," he said, and went back to the track. Julian's face did the thing it had been doing since the garden, that open quality, unfamiliar, like a muscle being used for the first time. He nodded at Seraphina. She nodded back. He went out. She stood in the middle of the room, with the track spread across the floor, and her son building something he was entirely certain about, and she reached into her pocket and felt the ring there, cool and small, and left it there. She sat down on the floor next to Theo. He handed her a piece of track without looking up. She knew where it went. She'd learned the system weeks ago, because Theo had required it of her, with the same thoroughness he required of everyone, and she had paid attention, and paying attention was what she had always done. She pressed it into place. It clicked. Theo moved forward. She looked at the window, the afternoon light coming in low and flat, the specific gold of late autumn. The kind of light that doesn't last, but while it's there makes everything look like it's seen something, and she breathed. In, out. The ring was in her pocket. Her mother's name was in the court record. Her son was building something on the floor in front of her, piece by piece, certain of the shape he was working toward. And Seraphina Vale, who had once sat on the edge of a bridal bed in an ivory dress and stared at a wall and waited for it to tell her something useful, sat on the floor next to her son in the afternoon light and understood, finally and simply, that the wall had never had anything to tell her. She had found the answers herself. She always had.